Hi. If you're hearing my voice, you have successfully made it to the first few weeks of small group communication. Congratulations. You've been through a lot of theory, you've been through a lot of introduction, you've got a solid blueprint for where we are and where we're going this semester. Now it's time to start talking about how these concepts apply to you. And I can think of no better chapter to start that process than here, Chapter 4. If you've known me for any amount of time at all, you know that the word that you see on the screen in front of you is a huge deal to me. I love talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am passionately committed to it. It's the lifeblood of what I do. It is the spring in my step, the song in my heart. It's everything I love. Why? I honestly don't know. But I love learning from other cultures, from other people groups that I'm not a part of. I like to be involved. I like to expand my territory. And some of my richest life lessons and richest life moments have come from enhancing and embracing diversity. So I'm committed to enhancing the profile of diversity, not only on our campus, but really just in life, in my kids, in my own personal walk, in everything that I do. But diversity is so much more than a buzzword. It's so much more than a touchy-feely word. It's become both of those things because we hear it so often, which causes us to not really think about it when we hear it. But in small group communication and in organizational communication, diversity really does matter. As noted earlier, groups are made up of individuals. Those individuals bring their own stories, their own worldviews, their own back narratives, and those all contribute to the overall composition of the group. But diversity isn't just important in terms of group processes. Diversity is also important just as a bigger perspective for groups, companies, organizations, and beyond. There are many competitive advantages to having diversity work for you, and here are just some of those. In terms of resource acquisition, companies known for their diversity tend to gain a reputation. That can be a highly skilled way of recruiting a highly skilled labor pool. So you see the strategy here. If you're known for diversity, you're going to get that reputation, and then underprivileged populations, minorities may actively seek you out, and you may gain a competitive advantage there. In terms of marketing, as markets become more diverse, a diverse workforce, demonstrates a certain commitment, which turns into a competitive advantage. Simply put, if you're, let's say, a person of color and you see a company that uses people of color in their advertisements, would you not be more likely to support that company over another one? Of course, that's not the only variable at play, but you see what this concept is saying here. Marketing can be a huge asset, and the marketing of your company through diverse means can be a huge asset as well. In terms of system flexibility, there's an appreciation of varying viewpoints when you have diverse people on your team. This produces a greater openness to ideas and helps during seasons of change. And this is something we talked about in the last chapter, Chapter 3. The same thing goes in terms of creativity. Diverse viewpoints enhance creativity. They enhance the decision-making process, and ultimately they enhance overall group performance. In terms of problem solving, diversity leads to better decisions because of a wider range of shared perspectives. Again, there's just more options at the table. And even in terms of cost reduction, failure to integrate all workers leads to higher turnover, absenteeism, and so forth. Ultimately, diversity can save you money. So then why is it such a buzzword? Something that's talked about so heavily, something that can garner eye rolls from people. Well, it's because we haven't fully grasped what diversity is. And I'm going to let you in a little secret. Most of the time, it's because those of us having those conversations occupy positions of privilege. We check all of the privilege markers. We're often mostly white. A lot of us are male, although not all of us. We're educated. We're in college. We're talking about these things. To get an education in the United States, you need to be fairly well off, so we're likely middle class or higher. Most of us are able-bodied. A significant portion of us are heterosexual. Almost all of us are cisgender, meaning we're not transgender. Do you see what I'm saying here? We occupy positions of privilege. So many of us feel, well, diversity, that doesn't apply to me. That's for black people and gay people and disabled people, and that's not for me. But it is, because as we can see, diversity matters to all of us, and it especially matters in the context of small groups. That line of thinking I just talked about, the it doesn't apply to me, really circles around one big term, and that's this: ethnocentrism, which is the belief that your own culture is inherently superior to all others. And it's the tendency to view all other cultures through the viewpoint of your own culture. I use this comic every time I talk about it because I think it hits the nail right on the head. It's the inability to see the other person's side because you're too busy focusing on your own. We often do this as a country. Not that there's anything wrong with being patriotic. There's nothing wrong with the United States, and I'm certainly not saying that. But in the United States, we tend to think we're the be-all, end-all. There's nothing else out there in the world, or what is out there in the world is less than what we have here. So we want to get a better grasp then on diversity, and we can do that by looking closely at culture. Now, really, what is culture? That's a big word too. Well, culture really just refers to the patterns of values, beliefs, symbols, norms, procedures, and behaviors that have been historically transmitted and are shared by a given group of persons. Often when we think of culture, we think, ooh, big, people from India, people from China, people from Africa, the LGBTQ culture. But culture is actually a much smaller and therefore also a much bigger concept. Culture is those sets of values, beliefs, symbols, patterns, norms that we all bring to the table. What does that mean? Well, that actually means that a group, a small group, the group that you're working in this semester, that in and of itself is a culture or is bound by culture. You're developing systems, patterns, ways of communicating that bind you all together, and you're creating that culture as well. Now, that's why it's important to think about the role of co-culture, where we, yes, are different, as you can see here, such as people from many different nationalities, but we may share some attributes. We may share gender, we may share poverty, we may share mindset, we may share a variety of different things. So when we actually map this out, it looks like this. Culture is the bigger guiding principle. And when we say culture, we're talking about that big type of culture, the patterns, values, beliefs, norms that historically have been transmitted and bind us all together. But co-cultures are groupings that see themselves as distinct, but also part of a larger grouping. So let's assume the word culture here was University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manatee students. And the co-cultures could be black students or black student advocacy groups, maybe a Black Lives Matter group on campus, and the STAND, the LGBTQ student organization. Those are each co-cultures. They are distinct. There's something that separates them from the overall population, but their identity is also understood in terms of being a USF student because they're both student organizations. This is important because often we make hasty generalizations and blame things on culture, but we fail to dig down deep and see that there are co-cultural elements at play as well, or perhaps it's just our own ignorance and culture has nothing to do with it at all. In terms of communication between and within co-cultures is intricate and it looks different for each. When you communicate within your own culture, as you see over here on the left, that's called intra-cultural communication, which is interaction between and among individuals from the same culture or co-culture. And the types of language you use and communication strategies you use are specific to the context and the understanding and the binding of that group. You may say certain things within that co-culture that you wouldn't say externally. Additionally, there may be things that you say within that group that other people who are not a part of that group can't say that because it's just not appropriate. Similarly, or divergently I should say, if you're communicating from co-culture to another co-culture, that's called intercultural communication. That's interaction between and among individuals from different cultures or co-cultures. I want you to be very, very familiar with what those are, both culture and co-culture, as well as the types of communication, intracultural and intercultural communication, because I can assure you that those will pop up on an exam. But let's talk about factors that affect cultural orientation. First is the role of culture itself. We know that in society there are many different types of cultures, and as our understanding of human diversity expands, so too does our theory. However, theoretically there have always been two main pools of culture that have been analyzed: individualistic culture and collectivistic culture. Now, individualistic culture refers to cultures in which the needs and wishes of the individual predominate over the needs of the group. We can say that in the United States, broadly speaking, we are an individualistic society, as opposed to a collectivistic society, which is a culture in which the needs and wishes of the group predominate over the needs of any one individual. Many Asian countries, Eastern Asian countries, would occupy this category. If you want to learn a little bit more about the difference, between individualistic and collectivistic cultures, see page 89 of your textbook. Second is the role of power distance. And power distance refers to the degree to which a culture emphasizes status and power differences among members of the culture. Status differences are often minimized in low power distance cultures and emphasized in high power distance cultures. So that basically means, are you part of a society that puts a lot of weight on being a leader, being rich, being in a high social position? Or do you not really care about those things? You're more concerned with the community as a whole. Factors that also affect cultural communication include factors related to uncertainty avoidance. That is, the degree to which members of a culture tend to avoid or embrace uncertainty and ambiguity. Cultures high in uncertainty avoidance prefer clear rules for interaction, and those in low uncertainty avoidance categories are often comfortable without guidelines. I think this varies greatly, and this is more of a co-cultural element, because even in the United States, this is dependent on a variety of other factors, including race, age, sex, and beyond. Next is masculine versus feminine language. Now, we're not talking about sex here, though we are going to talk about that in just a second. We're talking about as these apply to linguistic frames within culture. So masculinity here refers to the quality of cultures that value assertiveness and dominance. So for sake of conversation, we're classifying assertive and dominant as masculine characteristics, whereas femininity in this case is the quality of cultures that value nurturing and caring. Now, you know me, Mr. Feminist himself, I take quite the issue with saying that nurturing and caring are feminine qualities and assertiveness and dominance are masculine qualities, though I must admit, at their stereotypical roots, it is true. And that's how we regard it here. Not that it's always true everywhere and at every time, but for sake of conversation, we're going to assume that it's true here. And then finally, another factor that influences cultural communication is low versus high context communication. These are a little bit confusing, but low context communication is communication where the primary meaning of a message is carried by the verbal or explicit part of the message. And high context communication is communication where the primary meaning of a message is conveyed by features of the situation or context instead of the verbal or explicit. So again, your textbook gives some good examples on page 92, but I always think of the role of electronic mediated communication. In the age of texting, instant messaging, Facebook messaging, and beyond, the role of emojis, the role of linguistic structures such as all caps or italics, those types of things, are tending to shift us a little bit more into high context, where it's not so much what you say, but now how you say it, what emojis you use, therefore and beyond. I anticipate that in the next 5 to 7 years, communication scholars will really catch up in their research on this, and we'll see an influx of research that looks at low versus high context communication, especially in terms of electronic mediated communication. Now, if we're going to talk about diversity, and we're going to talk about culture, we must first talk about those big elements that we often associate with conversations on diversity. So we're going to look at those one by one, break apart what they are, break apart what they are not. So first we're going to look at race and ethnicity. The concepts of race and ethnicity have often been confused, often seen as overlapping, and while they do overlap to some degree, when we see or say race, we're basically at the most simple level referring to skin color. Those are the biological elements that pigment our skin in certain ways. Those are racial categories. Now, ethnicity may also include racial categories. It may also include biological functions, but ethnicity is much more social in function. So race refers to white, black, Asian, and beyond. But ethnicity is just not quite as easy to nail down. In fact, currently on the U.S. Census, Latino or of Hispanic origin is considered an ethnicity, not a race. So you see how it flows into that racial category, but it's beyond. Sometimes Jews are Jewish is seen as an ethnicity. On and on and on. Again, your textbook gives some examples, but be sure you understand the full differences between race and ethnicity. Another concept that's often confused is sex and gender. And to help me illustrate this concept, I pull on a favorite slide. I use it all the time. I love this slide, which is the genderbread person. And this helps us better understand what it means to be a man or a woman, or maybe neither one of those. What it means to be feminine or masculine or androgynous. What it means to be female or male or somewhere in between or not even on the spectrum. And then what it means to be heterosexual, homosexual, or again, something else altogether. The best way to understand the distinction between sex and gender is to understand that sex is what's between your legs. It is your genitalia, the organs you were born with. But gender is what's between your ears. It's your identity. So you may identify as a woman and indeed have a vagina, or vice versa, identify as a man and have a penis. But you could identify as a woman and have a biological penis. Those things are capable, they are possible, and it's really important not to regard those as ridiculous. Gender identity is a state of being, it's a feeling. Sex is chromosomal, it's biological. Both are subject to interpretation. And if you're interested in this concept in any way, shape, or form, I implore you to take Communication, Gender, and Identity with me, where we explore these concepts in depth. Now, gender expression may or may not coincide with gender identity. You can be a woman, but have a masculine gender identity, and indeed be biologically female. Do you see how this is so much more complex than what we've given it credit for? We tend to think, well, she's a woman, she sleeps with dudes, the end. It's not quite that simple. So closely related, we also have sexual orientation, which I think most people grasp. Heterosexual means sleeping with people of the opposite sex for the most part, and homosexual means sleeping with people of the same sex for the most part. But each and every one of these categories is not a binary. It's not black and white. It's not simple. It's a spectrum. Those spectrums change. They shift. They're subject to interpretation based on context, feeling, mood, expression. They are subject to an individual's decision, and that's where it's important to remember to be respectful. Now, a little less controversial, but often forgotten in terms of diversity, is the role of age. We see ageism quite frequently. In fact, there's been a new focus on reasons why people of older generations are not able to re-enter the workforce if they leave. And more findings are pointing to the fact that it's based on age discrimination. Now, starting on page 99 and going through page 101 of your textbook, they outline some of the different generational norms, generational structures that influence age. We're not going to get into those here. Just know that age is a demographic that's hugely important to consider in small groups. And if you're working with elderly populations, or if you have somebody in your group who is of a different age bracket, consider that in the process. Consider the different things they might bring to the table and how their experiences might change their thinking ever so slightly. Another crucial one to consider is the role of poverty or socioeconomic status. What people have in their bank accounts directly influences their mood, influences their will and motivation oftentimes, influences their capabilities, the resources they have access to. Thus, it's hugely important in small groups to account for the fact that not everybody may occupy the same position of privilege that you do. And what's going on in their own personal life and in their own personal finances may also influence how they approach the group. So some guidelines for intercultural communication. These come directly out of the textbook, but I've adjusted them ever so slightly. The textbook notes that we should communicate in a way that extends empathy and respect to all members of the group. However, this is an outdated perspective. Expressing empathy is closely related to expressing sympathy, which is related to having pity on a member. If we instead forgo extending empathy and instead extend respect to all members of a group, most likely we're extending empathy in the process, but doing so in a safe way. So number one guideline for intercultural communication, communicate in a way that extends respect to all members of the group. And then second, textbook notes that we should work to incorporate the key cultural values of all members into the group's procedures. However, not all members of every culture want to be the representative of that culture. Not every black person wants to be the black voice in a white group. So instead of working to incorporate the key cultural values, why don't we just work on incorporating all members into the group's procedures? That way, what they want to share is welcomed, and they can share it freely if they choose. But it doesn't dictate that they do so. Ultimately, this is about being mindful, and the textbook defines mindful communication as communication in which the participants are thoughtful, paying careful attention to what the other participants say and also to what they say. I call this being socially aware, thinking about the world beyond your place in it. So a few things to remember. Remember that all conversation is intercultural to some extent. You have a culture. Even if you're white, straight, middle class, you have a culture. And you bring cultural communication to the table for every conversation you have. Next, recognize, accept, and celebrate differences. See them as strengths. Don't just tolerate diversity. Embrace it openly. I promise you, you'll be a better person because of it. Then, resist making attributions of stupidity or ill intent. Don't assume somebody made the decision they did because of culture, and don't assume that a culture means that they don't have the same resources or the same intellect that you do. Not only is that ethnocentric, it's highly offensive. Be willing to discuss cultural differences openly, honestly, and respectfully if everybody of that cultural group wants to. Again, a black student or a black member of your group should not have to be the black voice. However, everybody in the group should remain open at all times to being willing to discuss cultural differences and celebrating culture together. And ultimately, be willing to adapt to difference. It's going to make you a better person. It's going to teach you leadership. It's going to allow you to enter the workforce with a full understanding that that workforce consists of many different types of people from many different walks of life. And if you want to be a leader in your field, you've got to master diversity. You've got to show that you can handle managing all types of people. And not only just managing them to get the task done, but that you can empower them in the process. We'll explore that concept in greater depth in a few weeks to come, but in the meantime, this concludes our lecture for Chapter 4. Thank you for tuning in. As always, please remember to complete your study guide in a timely fashion and upload by the due date. I look forward to talking more about diversity, equity, and inclusion in class, and in the meantime, get your creative wheels turning, start thinking about where you sit on the privilege spectrum, and be ready to share openly and honestly in our next class. Till next time, bye-bye.